I put the binocular on it, and I can see it spinning around, and I wouldn't bet my life on it being the S4B, but it sure's got to be something like it.
That was Gene Cernan reporting that sighting. Orbit.
We were that first crew that was going to get a chance to fly this vehicle and test this vehicle that was going to take human beings to the moon.
Mankind makes one giant leap and lands the first man on the moon. A historic achievement for the human race. But that giant leap took many lunges, trips, and falls in order for our astronauts to actually achieve this moment. And along the way, many space researchers have speculated that our astronauts may have seen UFOs and anomalous structures on the surface of the moon.
You know, we have a very interesting little document from 1950. There was a Canadian government official named Wilbert Smith, and he was very interested in these flying saucers. Wilbert Smith was a real smart guy. He was an engineer, he was a scientist, and he had a kind of a mid-upper level position in the Canadian bureaucracy. And he was able to go down to Washington, D.C. In September 1950 to the Canadian embassy there, and while he was hanging around D.C., he goes and talks to some American scientists, and one in particular. And this was a scientist who was very well plugged in. And this man's name was Robert Sarbacher. We learned many years later. It was very, very powerful. Sarbacher says, yes, UFO flying saucers do exist. I can confirm that for you. Their modus operandi is unknown, but the United States government considers this the most classified subject of all, 2 levels higher than the hydrogen bomb, which in 1950 was about as big as you could get. But flying saucers were higher than that. So Smith types up this memo for his supervisors in the Canadian government, and that's that. But actually, that wasn't that, because years after he died, his private papers were analyzed, and the exact name of that scientist was written there, and that scientist, Robert Sarbacher, was still alive. And researchers found him, and Sarbacher confirmed the whole thing. He said, yeah, that actually did happen. So anyway, my point simply is, you've got very clear knowledge among the highest circles in Washington back in 1950, for example, and in the military back in 1950, that yes, absolutely, UFOs were the most sensitive subject out there. Now, ask yourself, why would that be? You know, why would that be the most sensitive subject if it was all nonsense and hallucinations and hoaxes and things like this, you know? Well, obviously, it's a lot more than that. And when you go through the declassified literature, such that we have, there's still a lot we don't have, but we have enough to show very, very clearly that you had countless violations of sensitive airspace by objects that did not look normal, that were doing things that were not supposed to be possible over places that you were never supposed to go. All right, whether that means over Los Alamos, you know, where the scientists developed the atomic bomb, or the Hanford nuclear plant in the state of Washington, which was a major plutonium processing facility, a lot of toxic waste there to this day, or over the Oak Ridge nuclear, facility in Tennessee, where, again, a great deal of science on the atomic bomb was developed. All of these very sensitive places, you don't just go hang out over them, but UFOs were hanging out over them. And, jets would be sent to intercept. In one case, we know of anti-aircraft battalions were alerted. Can you imagine if the public knew about this at the time? They didn't. They didn't find out until years and years later, after these documents were declassified. By then, they were just sunk into the black hole of the public memory, and no one really seemed to care. But back in 1950, if these incidents had become known, I think people would have cared quite a bit. They were very important. My point here simply is this: the subject of UFOs has always been considered to be of the highest level of security classification that we know of. And so now if you've got NASA engaged in any capacity with the United States military on any type of classified mission that it engages in, there is no way ever that they're just going to tell the world, oh, look, there are all these UFOs, people. How cool is that? No, that'll never happen. That will never happen until the laws change. And those laws haven't changed. The subject still remains highly classified, even well into the 21st century. It is, we can talk a little bit more about it now than, say, a few years ago. That's interesting and that's true. But there's still a red line, and thou shalt not go over that red line.
It was one of these clear days, and that's why I was up, because you could see to infinity, and it was an ideal day for aerial photography. And it appeared silver with a shadow underneath, so it was metallic, and it was moving at a rate of speed, I would say 150 miles an hour, plus or minus, and appeared to be maybe 20 meters across.
We decided to analyze the Catalina films.
And there seems to be some holes or some kind of transparency underneath here. One takes a good look at this, and considering that the speed of the object, as reported by Lee Hansen, the photographer, is that this is moving at about 120 miles an hour, this begins to look like a small commercial airplane. And one can draw the comparison that you have the bright wing on the top, the windows, and the stabilizer, the rudder structure, and that's it. The Catalina film, I'm afraid, falls into the category of an identified flying airplane.
Lunar orbiter missions were initiated in early 1964 and consisted of 5 identical unmanned spacecraft to investigate the surface of the moon. The main purpose of the program was to locate smooth, level areas on the moon's near side to confirm the areas as suitable for manned landing sites for the Apollo program. Other program objectives were to collect data on the moon's gravitational field to provide precision trajectory information and study radiation and micrometeoroid flux in the vicinity of the moon. The orbiter took pictures of the moon's surface. More than 90% of the pictures taken were transmitted successfully, including the historic Earth rise taken from the moon on August 23, 1966. It was hailed at that time as the greatest photograph of the 20th century. The orbiter also obtained environmental data during all periods of visibility. Some photographs were not transmitted. However, when the transmitting equipment failed during the readout operation, only a small number of pictures were lost, and other data collection was not affected. Lunar Orbiter 2 made significant additions to the techniques and data required to land on the moon. Mission 3 differed from the previous 2 missions in that it was a site confirmation mission rather than a site selection mission. Despite some operational problems during the mission, Orbiter 4 was highly successful in fulfilling its purpose. The photographs obtained provided information and detail at least 10 times better than Earth-based observations. The photography captured during Mission 5 was an incredible improvement in resolution from Mission 4. This allowed NASA to gain better insight into sites of interest on the near side of the moon. The far side photography provided coverage of essentially all areas not covered during the preceding 4 missions. In the early 2000s, a former Air Force technician specializing in photographic printer repair made a shocking statement to the public about his experience while working for the NSA during the 1960s.
I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened.
Another now famous unidentified lunar object was spotted by the Lunar Orbiter 3 in February of 1967. A total of 149 medium resolution and 477 high resolution frames were returned from this mission. And in one composite image, an object known as the Shard can be seen. This object was supposedly located between the Bruce crater and the Sinus Midi Mare plain area of the moon. NASA has never acknowledged this phenomenon.
And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. So it was rare that someone would do something like this, but this fellow and I were the same rank. I think he was very distressed. He had the same pallor and demeanor as the scientists outside the room. They were just as concerned as he was, and he needed to discuss it with somebody. So that was the end of it right there. I didn't take it any further than that. I just filed it away. But the interesting thing, every day that I went home, I would think to myself, I can't wait to hear about this on the news, And, so I'd turn on the TV and I'd look at the news to see if they're going to announce, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon, being really naive, And, of course, here it is 30-some years later, and we still haven't heard about it.
Researcher and filmmaker James Fox started his journey into UFOs through Apollo astronaut testimony.
Basically, out of this whole UFO phenomenon, when did you become interested in the idea that NASA astronauts have seen UFOs in space and that possibly had been covered up?
I never did until I wasn't actively looking for UFOs in space, NASA. I watched an interview in the early 90s with Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, sixth man to walk the moon. And he talked about UFOs very openly. And I thought, here's a man who's got everything to lose and nothing to gain by what he's doing.
It's the sort of disclosure UFO investigators are demanding from the U.S. government. How would people react?
Well, it would be kind of good. It's about time.
Former astronaut Edgar Mitchell is the sixth man to walk on the moon and a firm believer that aliens have visited our planet repeatedly. So I had to ask, why are they coming in these little glancing visits and we haven't had a more meaningful dialogue or contact or attempt to communicate with these people?
Well, I think we have.
Really?
I think we have, but it is not common knowledge.
Mitchell told me after he returned from the moon, he was briefed at the Pentagon by a high-ranking officer, whose name he would not reveal, who said the U.S. government does have evidence of alien spacecraft and is keeping it a secret.
Well, I think the reason it's still a secret is power and control, controlling whatever technology exists.
All of this is fascinating stuff, if it is true.
I mean, I've talked to government insiders and intelligence folks, and they kind of laugh at it. But obviously, they have secret craft that we don't know about. That's obvious. But whether they have successfully reverse engineered what they recovered in Roswell, that's that's something that I have not seen the evidence for. I'm not saying definitively that it didn't happen, that they weren't successfully reverse engineered. I have seen zero evidence of it. That's just me. And people can disagree all they want, and that's fine.
The Apollo missions began in an irregular way compared to the previous manned capsule missions. This turned out disastrous for the first Apollo 1 test pilots. Apollo 2 and 3, which were unmanned, were called AS-202 and AS-203 respectively, in which the newly designed Apollo capsule was married to the Saturn 1B rocket vehicle system. July 5th, 1966. An unmanned flight of the Saturn 1B rocket. It carried no command and service module, as its purpose was to verify the design of the S-4B rocket stage restart capability. This would later be used in the Apollo program to boost astronauts from Earth orbit on a trajectory to the moon. It achieved its goals, but the stage was inadvertently destroyed after 4 orbits. Launched unmanned on August 25, 1966, by a Saturn 1B vector and suborbital flight, this flight was used to perform tests on the command and service module, which was later recovered, destined to perform a manned landing on the moon. On January 27, 1967, at Launchpad 34 at the Kennedy Space Center, astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee were sealed inside of their spacecraft for a plugs-out test. The spacecraft was pressurized with pure oxygen. Numerous communication problems were encountered during the test. Suddenly, a spark occurred in the wiring of the spacecraft somewhere below Grissom's feet. In the pure oxygen atmosphere, the fire flashed through the spacecraft, consuming anything flammable. The crew struggled to open the hatch of the command module. It was a complex task that required too much time. Before they could open the hatch, the fumes given off from the fire asphyxiated them.
One thing to take note of about the Apollo 1 mission is that many of the astronauts were very nervous about this Apollo spacecraft and its rapid buildup, concurrently with the Gemini mission still being finished. Many of the astronauts were being swapped over to the Apollo mission, and this rapid buildup looked like it was going to cause malfunctions and errors to that spacecraft. Walter Schirra, he actually commented to Gus Grissom, one of the pilots of the early Gemini project that had been swapped over to Apollo 1, that something didn't ring right about the Apollo 1 spacecraft, and that if he saw any signs of trouble, that he should get out quickly.
After this disastrous fire during the Apollo 1 test, NASA decided to run many successive test flights that were unmanned. Mike Bara famously co-authored the book Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA, in which he speculates with photo evidence that NASA has been covering up anomalies on the moon.
The other possibility is that we have had far more advanced technology than we will acknowledge for the last 60, 70 years, and it's some of our guys having a little fun with the spam in a can dudes that are stuck in the Apollo program. That's what Gus Grissom once referred to Apollo as. You know, we're spam in a can, he was overheard to say, and they've been to the moon already, they've been to Mars already, they got technology we can't even dream of here. And they're sticking us up here in these rickety old rockets and risking our lives. And of course, he ended up losing his life, and a lot of people have a lot of suspicions about that he was such a vocal advocate for the fact that they had better technology than they were using to go to the moon, and it really made him angry and could have made him a target.
November 9th, 1967, was the day in which the Saturn V launch vehicle was first tested. This was the rocket that would send astronauts to the moon. On April 4th, 1968, this unmanned flight tested the Saturn V's ability to perform a translunar injection using 80% of the payload, which the later manned mission would perform again. Unfortunately, the phenomenon known as the pogo effect damaged the two Rocketdyne engines on the second stage when the internal fuel lines ruptured. The Rocketdyne J2 engine on the S4B third stage also failed to restart translunar injection, so the correct translunar velocity could not be achieved. Nevertheless, NASA considered the Saturn V ready to receive its first crew. October 11th, 1968. Apollo 7 was the first manned spaceflight of the Apollo program. Don Eisel, Commander Walter M. Schirra, and Walter Cunningham's crew spend almost 11 days in space testing a command module spacecraft designed to orbit the Earth and safely bring humans to the moon and back again. The mission objective was to demonstrate crew performance with the command service module.
Apollo 7 was also go for an exhaustive series of tests of its worthiness in space. One of the first things which had to be learned was whether the astronauts could control the spacecraft combined with the S4B Saturn stage. A very similar thing would have to be done during the early phases of a lunar mission. The answer was not long in coming.
S4B test complete. Beautiful. That was outstanding.
Real fine. Outstanding.
Next, the spacecraft and S4B stage were separated. The question now was whether the astronauts could turn their spacecraft around and control it to the degree required for future physical link-ups with equipment in space. For this, too, would have to be done in the lunar flight. And again, the answer was yes.
Was a little flashes like Gemini?
Something that will not be seen in the lunar flight or in any other forthcoming Apollo mission were the panels at the top of the S4B stage. They will simply be jettisoned in the future, but they drew comment in Apollo 7.
And the slot panel at the top, left, and bottom opened at I would guess to be about a 45-degree angle, and the slot panel on the right is just opened maybe 30 degrees at the very best. Roger. Looks like you're looking at a four-jawed angry alligator.
During this mission, multiple tests for the Saturn rocket system and the astronaut crew interactions were successful. This was the first mission to use the Apollo flight suit and to successfully complete a live video transmission from space.
Always before, we've had to be content with merely listening to our astronauts during their flights. In Apollo 7, through the medium of television, we could actually see them in space for the first time and become better acquainted with weightless life aboard a spacecraft.
You're picking up, I can read it now, just a minute. It says from that...
December 21st, 1968. Apollo 8 was the second crewed mission of the Apollo program and the first mission to bring humans to the moon's orbit. They were the first humans to leave low Earth orbit, the first to see the entire Earth, the first to see the dark side of the moon, and the first to see the sunrise of the Earth from the moon.
T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. Here we have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Apollo 8 took 3 days to reach the moon. It orbited 10 times over 20 hours.
This transmission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We've been 31 hours, about 20 minutes into flight. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon.
So Apollo 8 glided on silently, farther from Earth than man had ever before been. A microscopic dot of life in the cosmic void.
Face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light."
The crew also made a televised Christmas Eve broadcast in which they read the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis. This broadcast was the most watched in history at the time.
And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst."
The choice to spend Christmas Eve in lunar orbit was made because that was the time of optimal lighting conditions for surveying the Apollo landing site 1. During the mission, astronauts took photos of the Earth from the moon, including the second Earthrise picture, which was higher quality than the Earthrise taken previously by the lunar orbiter.
Apollo 8, Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles, over?
Okay, Houston. The moon is essentially gray. No color. Looks like plaster of Paris. Okay, or sort of a grayish beach sand. We can see quite a bit of detail. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Many of them look like, especially the round ones, look like hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort.
Okay, 11, we have a picture. We see the Earth right in the center of the screen, over.
During these TV transmissions, the astronauts also provided a verbal commentary to accompany the footage being broadcast. Contrary to popular belief, these broadcasts were not extemporaneous or improvised performances. Rather, both the footage and dialogue were entirely scripted out prior to the flight. The Apollo cover story was specifically designed to allow those missions to be conducted in the public eye, while at the same time actively concealing the fact that evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life might have been discovered in space and on the moon. The scripting protocols followed during the Apollo program were for the most part highly effective at ensuring the astronauts did not divulge any sensitive information while they communicated over the public radio channel with Houston. However, when the astronauts were not in radio contact with Mission Control, they did on occasion make some unscripted and rather candid comments to each other about what they were observing outside their spacecraft. These comments were captured by a device mounted inside the Apollo Command and Service Module that was known as the Data Storage Equipment Recorder, or DSE. The Apollo DSE was essentially a black box cockpit voice and telemetry recording system. In addition to recording a variety of spacecraft parameters, the DSE's 14-track tape also recorded many internal crew conversations that took place when the astronauts were not communicating with Mission Control. Although it is presumed that the recordings were destroyed or lost, the transcriptions were made at NASA by the woman shown in this image and others. And although they were originally classified, those transcripts can be found today in the NASA archives. Many of the comments captured by the DSE were made when the spacecraft was behind the far side of the moon, with the astronauts describing various sights not visible from Earth.
What's very interesting about the Apollo 8 manned mission to the moon is that we would hear about all of these things that astronauts and UFO researchers would repeat being demonstrated in the communications, photos, and footage throughout many other Apollo manned missions. That is, structures on the far side of the moon, UFOs and anomalous activity in space, as well as this eerie music or strange sounds that the astronauts only heard when they were on the far side of the moon. And what's interesting is that we will hear a more detailed account and more evidence of this strange music or sounds on the far side of the moon in the later Apollo 10 manned mission. And one has to wonder, is this sound emanating from a base or maybe these structures that were observed on the far side of the lunar surface? Or was the sound actually coming from space? And does the moon operate as some kind of insulator to feedback coming from space?
March 3rd, 1969. Apollo 9 was the third manned space mission in the Apollo program, and the first flight with the Apollo lunar module. The crew spent 10 days in low Earth orbit, testing several critical aspects of landing on the moon, including lunar module engines, spacesuit life support systems, navigation systems, and docking maneuvers.
We were that first crew that was going to get a chance to fly this vehicle and test this vehicle that was going to take human beings to the moon. We were very, very aware of the time pressure, and everything has to go right if we're for sure going to meet Kennedy's goal of getting to the moon in that decade and back. We tested every possible thing that could be tested. The mission was completely dedicated to testing the systems, the engines, and the guidance and navigation, all kinds of things that we could do in Earth orbit.
Really very difficult to get the coordinate system in your head. Normally we dock looking out this way, and for the docking with the lunar module, you had to look out this way. So the control system didn't operate the way it normally would.
How does that sports car handle, Jim?
Pretty nice.
This was the first manned flight of a lunar module, the first docking and extraction with the lunar module, the first completion of a two-man spacewalk, and the second docking of a two-man spacecraft.
We depressurized both the lunar module and the command module, and Rusty was going to get out and transfer over to the command module. And we were doing that to see that it could be done.
Two telecasts were made to Earth from Apollo 9. The first, on March 5th, lasted for almost 7 minutes. The second telecast on the following day lasted for about 13 minutes and only showed interior views of the lunar module. Photographs taken as part of the multi-spectral terrain photographic experiment were successful.
Now, Dave wanted to get out of the spacecraft, too, so we... part of the mission was for him to open up the hatch. So we were all out there in a vacuum.
Here we are at this historic moment that we're all part of, not just the astronauts, but everybody who's alive today, and we're all on this small planet as representative of life. We're beginning to move out from this planet, which, as far as we know, contains all of the life in our little corner of the universe.
Manual attitude control is good. Roger, copy.
Good. I'm going to pull your flag. Oops, I bent that one.
BTU expenditure for each crewman averaging 1,300 surgeon reports.
And, Jack, this is Houston. Looks like your water temperature's getting pretty high. You might want to go to intermediate cooling or slow down or something. Looks like you're getting a little warm.
May 18th, 1969. The Apollo 10 mission was the fourth manned mission of the Apollo program.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 10, you can tell the world that we have arrived.
This mission was a successful synthesis of the previous two completed missions. It resulted in the lunar module being placed for the first time in lunar orbit.
And they give a silver Snoopy for excellence awards. I wanted to honor the people that had worked so hard, so we call it Snoopy. But you needed two names, so naturally the other one was Charlie Brown.
Stafford and Cernan were placed in the lunar module Snoopy, after leaving the command service module. They managed to place themselves in an elliptical lunar orbit, about 14 kilometers above the lunar surface.
You're amazed at what you see. The one thing that always amazed me were the size of the boulders. There were these gigantic craters, and down at the bottom would be boulders, and up on the rim would be boulders.
During the second and final return to the moon, the lunar module lost control, which was regained shortly thereafter by its pilot, Thomas Stafford.
Yeah, okay, something went wild there on that station. And we're all set. We didn't lock it. We're going ahead to the automobile.
Charlie Brown, Houston, they got staging. They had a wild gyration, though, but they got it under control.
One thing people always ask, were you frightened? Were you scared? The answer is no. There were fighter pilots, test pilots, so we knew what risks were. You did everything you could to mitigate the risk, but there was a risk. And so we understood that.
After completing this maneuver, the lunar module was abandoned and launched into orbit around the sun. As a final result, the mission was a success. Separation and docking tests in lunar orbit between the command module and the lunar module were all successful. The lunar module descended to an altitude of approximately 15 kilometers above the lunar surface.
Well, we had a series of debriefings with them because we had all the procedures worked out. In fact, I remember I went to Neil and says, buddy, here you are. Here's all the techniques, all the procedures down to the last 50,000 feet. And you take it there, hard descent on the surface, 50,000 feet up, it's all done. So they just followed all the procedures we had. We're using the Hasselblad cameras to get the highest resolution available then, and the radar was going. So radar mapped, photo mapped, and visually mapped.
But I'll tell you one thing, when we went over, we made 2 passes over the landing site, and I tell you what, I think I said things that, boy, we are down among them. I felt like I had to pick up my feet to keep from dragging on top of the mountains. I mean, we were close, and we're going over those hills at 3,000 miles an hour. So you can just imagine what that was like, and it was one of those quick touch and goes. We didn't have a chance to put our tail hook down to stay, but and that would have been the big part of the challenge. Nonetheless, we were only the second flight to go to the moon, the first to take the lunar module, and it was the right decision to be made to get everything done. And we found some problems that had we attempted to land might have kept us from landing and then paved the way for Apollo 11 to go ahead and successfully land. So it was the right decision at the right time.
I've looked at a lot of transcripts. The Apollo Lunar Surface Journal was great for that. On Apollo 10, which is where we have the images of Sinus Medii, it's really fascinating because Gene Cernan was on that mission as well as Apollo 17. And they're at 50,000 feet. And he says, wow, we are really down among them now. Like, there's nothing at 50,000 feet. If the moon is what they tell us is, unless it's this artificial glass structure at 50,000 feet.
That they're scared to hit it.
Yeah. Meaning he's in amongst towering stuff. Well, it is in the mountains, because the mountains aren't that high for sure.
In addition to recording telemetry related to the performance of the lunar module spacecraft itself, the DSEA also made audio recordings of any crew conversation throughout the mission.
Houston, 2 minutes to LOS. Everybody here says Godspeed.
Okay, and we'll see him right on the other side in orbit.
Roger, 7620. Okay, this has got to be the greatest sight ever.
You ought to see it up here.
Noises reportedly were heard in May 1969 by the Apollo 10 astronauts as they circled the moon. The sounds, which lasted about an hour, were recorded and transmitted to Mission Control in Houston.
That is music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? Do you hear that whistling sound? We are getting data. We don't have any voice communication yet.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 10, you can tell the world that we have arrived.
Roger, 10, it's good to hear from you.
I wouldn't believe this thing.
Roger, 10, we're still having some kind of problems lighting up. We'd like you to go to wide beam for 30 seconds and then back to narrow. Over.
I can see it with the naked eye, and then I put the binocular on it, and I can see it spinning around, and I wouldn't bet my life on it being the S4B, but it sure's got to be something like it.
That was Gene Cernan reporting that sighting.
You know, it's a beautiful sight. We're sitting here, and it's almost like science fiction looking back at it, Bruce. This is the Peacock of Apollo 10.
Roger.
And we'd like to say hello from the 5 of us, if we may.
Roger.
Charlie, this is it's so hard to describe. You can go right up. It's incredible.
Okay, this has got to be the greatest sight ever.
You ought to see it up here.
The land masses don't seem to stand out quite as clearly today as they did yesterday.
How's the view, 10?
We have our astute geologists here overlooking the surface, and they'll report a minute.
Roger, standing by. Over.
Okay, we're just passing from the highlands over into the Maury area, and you can pass on the Jack. We caught a couple of real pretty little volcanoes. There's no doubt about them, and we got a couple of good high-resolution photos. And it still looks kind of brownish gray to us here. Over.
Roger, we copy.
Yeah, there was a place back there where there was one volcano, or whatever it was, that it was all white on the outside, but definitely black around the top of it.
Roger.
Charlie, it might sound corny, but the view is really out of this world.
Roger. We had a couple of comments the back row that I want to see. Apollo 10, Houston, 2 minutes to LOS. Everybody here says Godspeed.
Okay, and we'll see you right on the other side in orbit.
Roger, 762255.
Many skeptics and debunkers will remark on the fact that mainstream media was not reporting on UFOs, anomalies, and structures being witnessed by astronauts during the Apollo manned missions. And the simple reason why mainstream media wasn't exposed to this back in the 1960s and 70s during the Apollo missions is because that information was deeply classified. In fact, the DSEA tapes weren't actually declassified till 12 years after these Apollo manned missions. And additionally, we didn't have
photography and film fully examined by many of the UFO researchers and independent researchers like Luna Cognita until